During Easter dinner, when I refused to let my son-in-law's parents move into my home, his smile vanished, and so did the glass in his hand. It shattered against my cheek while my daughter screamed that, "She's so selfish." I didn't cry out, I didn't react. I simply stood up from the table, grabbed my keys, and drove straight to the emergency room. As blood soaked through the gauze, I calmly sent a message to my lawyer. Phase 1 is complete. And as I walked out, I knew they had just sealed their own fate. Welcome to the story. Before we dive in, please subscribe, and tell us where in the world are you watching from today. Please note that while the core message is vital, certain events and names have been fictionalized to enhance your learning experience. Any resemblance to actual persons or situations is purely coincidental. My name is Veda Sterling, 68 years old and a retired federal prosecutor who spent 40 years putting monsters in cages, though I never expected to find one at my own dinner table. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent over the rolling hills of Millbrook, casting long skeletal shadows across the rose garden that had become my sanctuary and my confessional. I was on my hands and knees in the rich, damp soil, the familiar scent of earth, and double delight roses clinging to my skin. Tom had loved these roses. They were finicky, demanding, and utterly beautiful, much like the cases I used to build against the Marcello crime family back in the 90s. I moved with the rhythmic, practiced precision of a surgeon, my shears making a sharp, clean snip as I pruned away a dead branch. I am keeping them alive for you, Tom. Every petal, every thorn. It was a quiet communion, the kind that only widows truly understand. The silence of the estate was absolute. A luxury bought with 40 years of high-alert living and a witness protection placement that had once felt like a prison sentence, but now felt like a fortress. Have you ever heard a voice you loved turn into a weapon? I could hear the sharpening of the blade in my daughter's very first hello. The sharp, violent vibration of the phone in my apron pocket shattered the tranquility. I didn't reach for it immediately. I let it buzz against my hip, counting the seconds, analyzing the intrusion before I even saw the screen. When I finally pulled it out, the name flashing back at me was Rachel. My daughter Rachel Porter, 42, usually called only when she needed a signature or a loan for Derek's latest luxury car habit, but today her voice carried the heavy, false weight of a manufactured crisis. I swiped the screen and put the phone to my ear, my prosecutor's mind already clicking into high gear. "Mom, it is an emergency." She started, her voice pitched in a thin, rehearsed panic that set my teeth on edge. "We don't know where else to turn. Derek's parents, Warren and Patricia, they lost everything in Florida. The business, the house, it is all gone. They are practically on the street." I stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from my knees, my eyes narrowing. I could hear the cadence of her breathing, the way she paused for dramatic effect. It was a performance, a sloppy one at that. A lie is like a scent. Once you have hunted as many wolves as I have, you can smell it, even through a digital signal. "Rachel, take a breath," I said, my voice calm and devoid of the alarm she was fishing for. "That sounds terrible. What is it you need?" "We were thinking." She continued, her confidence growing as she sensed my apparent compliance. "Maybe we could all have Easter dinner at your house. It would be a way to welcome them, to show them they still have family. And well, we need to discuss a permanent solution for them." I stared at a cluster of red roses, seeing the entire chessboard laid out in a single move. This wasn't an invitation. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a holiday. My daughter was the battering ram, and Derek Porter was the architect behind her. "Of course, Rachel," I replied, my tone shifting into the sweet, slightly frail widow persona I had perfected for the neighbors. "My home is always open to family. Bring everyone. Tell Warren and Patricia I would be honored to host them." The gratitude on the other end was sickeningly effusive. She hung up, and the silence that rushed back into the garden felt cold. My house is not a home anymore. It is an interrogation room with better curtains. I didn't return to my roses. I walked toward the back porch, my gait steady and purposeful, the faux frailty of Mary Thompson dropping away to reveal the steel of Veda Sterling. I entered the house through the mudroom, the cool air conditioning hitting my face like a splash of cold water. I didn't head for the kitchen to start a shopping list. Instead, I bypassed the living room and went straight to the heavy mahogany door of what the family thought was my reading room. It was a small windowless space lined with books, but behind the third shelf was the localized server that controlled every inch of the Sterling estate. I sat in the leather chair, the blue light of the monitors illuminating my face. I began powering up the system, watching as 6 different 4K feeds flickered to life. I checked the pinhole cameras disguised in the crown molding of the dining room and the high-fidelity microphones I had legally installed under single-party consent laws. I ensured my recording pen was charging on the desk. "They think I am a lonely widow," I whispered to the empty room. "They have forgotten who I was before I was mom. They have forgotten that I spent my life dismantling conspiracies far more sophisticated than a son-in-law's gambling debts." My pulse began to quicken, a familiar metallic taste of adrenaline rising in my throat. This was the same feeling I used to get right before a raid, the moment when the evidence was secure and the target was walking into the light. Phase 1 begins now. I opened a digital folder on the server labeled Porter. It was filled with 6 months of research bank statements and surveillance photos I had gathered myself. I knew about Derek's $430,000 debt. I knew about the bankruptcy fraud Warren had filed in Florida. They thought they were coming to a slaughterhouse, and they were right. They just didn't realize they were the livestock. I looked at the portrait of Tom on the desk, his eyes kind and steady even in the digital glow. I reached out and touched the frame, my fingers lingering on the wood. "They are coming for the house, Tom, and I am going to make sure they regret the day they thought I was weak." Rob Sterling's office didn't smell like justice. It smelled of expensive cedar and the kind of high-grade whiskey men drink when they're about to deliver bad news. I had driven into Millbrook under a sky that had turned a bruised, heavy purple, the weight of the previous task's revelation still pressing against my chest like a physical stone. They were coming for the house, and as I walked through the glass-paneled doors of the firm, I felt the predatory chill of my old life as a federal prosecutor settling back over my skin. I wasn't here as a grieving widow. I was a strategist coming to review the battlements. Rob Sterling, my brother-in-law and a 65-year-old retired judge who knew the law better than he knew his own children, arrived with the quiet gravity of a storm on the horizon. He stood as I entered, his silver hair catching the dim afternoon light, his eyes scanning my face for the fraying edges of a breakdown he expected but would never find. He knew better than to offer a hug. Instead, he gestured toward the leather armchair that felt as stiff and uncompromising as the man himself. "Veda, you are not just setting a trap." Rob said, his voice a low rumble as he poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. "You are using yourself as the piece of cheese." I watched him sit, the dry, papery texture of the legal folders on his desk, rasping as he shifted them. "I've spent 40 years as a prosecutor." "Rob," I replied, my voice steady and icy. "I know exactly how to handle a rat. We didn't waste time on pleasantries. We were here to finalize the barricades around the Sterling estate, a property worth $2,350,000 that Derek Porter had already mentally sold. We verified the standing of the Emily and Tom Sterling Irrevocable Trust, a legal fortress I had established long ago, to ensure that the home Tom built remained untouchable. Legally, I owned nothing that a creditor or a desperate son-in-law could seize. I was a tenant in my own legacy, a tactical ghost in a house made of wood and glass. Do you know what the hardest part of a trial is? It's not the evidence. It's the moment you realize the person you're looking at is a total stranger. Rob leaned forward, the glint of sunlight off the brass scales of justice on his desk momentarily blinding me. He pulled up the digital records for the bait checking account on his monitor, the screen bathing his face in a sterile blue light. There it was, $173. It was a meager, almost insulting balance, the only liquid asset the family would find if they tried to hack my records or bully a signature out of me. $173, Rob muttered. "It's almost insulting." I smiled, a thin, sharp expression that felt more like a bared tooth than a gesture of warmth. "It is the perfect amount to make a greedy man feel desperate," I said. "And a desperate man makes mistakes." Then I confirmed the detail that made Rob's hand pause over his glass. I told him about the secret wire transfer I had made in February, $430,000, pulled from a hidden offshore account, to anonymously clear Derek's debt to the bookies. Rob stared at me, the low hum of his desktop computer filling the sudden silence. "You cleared his marker. He's already free." "Yes," I said. "He has a clean slate, Rob. He doesn't need to steal the house. He doesn't need to attack his mother-in-law. If he makes a move now, it is pure, unadulterated greed. Greed doesn't just blind you, it makes you stupid. And stupid people are the easiest to catch." The final part of our protocol was the most difficult to stomach. Rob reached into a heavy manila folder and handed me a set of documents I hadn't looked at in years. These were the disinheritance papers Rachel had signed 5 years ago. I felt the cold weight of the keys in my pocket as I stared at her signature. At the time, she had been so desperate for a tech startup bailout that she hadn't even read the fine print. She had traded her birthright for $100,000 that Derek had liquidated in months. Rachel chose her side when she stopped calling me Mom and started calling me a resource. I whispered my hand, not shaking, as I tucked the death warrant for our relationship into my bag. "Once we pull the trigger on this, there is no going back to Sunday dinners," Rob warned. I stood up, the smell of cedar and whiskey following me to the door. "I'm not looking for a dinner invitation, Rob. I'm looking for a conviction." I felt like a spider weaving a web out of legal statutes and digital ink, and the first vibrations on the silk were already beginning. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking on the hardwood with a rhythmic, mechanical finality. The office felt smaller than it had when I arrived, or perhaps I had simply grown into the space my old self used to occupy. I was Veda Sterling again, and the world was beginning to look like a series of exhibits and cross-examinations. As I tucked the disinheritance papers into my bag, Rob asked one final question. "Are you ready to see what they will do when they find out the safe is empty?" I didn't answer him. I didn't have to. The answer was waiting for me in the wind-swept silence of the cemetery, where the real reason for this war lay buried beneath 6 feet of New York soil. I don't go to the cemetery to talk to a headstone. I go to remind myself that some promises are written in blood and kept in silence. As I drove through the winding, frost-nipped back roads of Millbrook, the heater in my sedan hummed a low mechanical tune that couldn't quite ward off the chill settling in my bones. Every turn in the road was a page from a book I had been writing for 25 years. I found myself flashing back to 1999, the year my life as a high-profile federal prosecutor in the criminal division came to a violent screeching halt. I remembered the Marcello trial, the way the lead defendant looked at me with eyes like dead marbles, and the day the U.S. Marshals arrived at my door with the paperwork that would erase my existence. "We lose our names today, Tom," I had whispered to my husband as we sat in the back of an armored SUV. "But we keep each other. Veda Sterling died in that moment so that Mary Thompson could survive." We spent the next 2 decades building a quiet, unassuming life from the ashes of my career, hiding behind the mask of a suburban couple, while I quietly maintained the offshore accounts and hidden digital trails that were the only remnants of my true self. Have you ever looked at your own child and wondered if you raised a stranger, or worse, if you raised the very kind of monster you spent your life putting away? I pulled through the iron gates of the Millbrook Cemetery, the tires crunching over gravel like bone fragments. The silence here was different from the silence at home. It was heavier, more permanent. I walked until I stood before the sharp gray granite marker that bore Tom's name. Standing there, I remembered his final grueling battle in 2019. Rachel and Derek had seen only a week-old man tethered to an oxygen tank, a liability they were eager to be rid of. They never realized the immense financial and legal strength I was exerting behind the scenes to keep him comfortable. They saw a dying man, Tom, I murmured to the cold air. I saw a king who deserved every second of peace I could buy him. They thought the $820,000 in medical debt had bankrupted me, that the house was all I had left. I had let them believe it. I had used my hidden assets to liquidate every penny of that debt years ago, specifically to see if my daughter would value me more than the inheritance she thought was dwindling. Grief is a luxury I can't afford right now, not while the vultures are already circling the body. I knelt by the grave, my knees pressing into the damp grass, and touched the cold stone as if it were Tom's hand. The biting chill of the evening wind whipped through my coat, but I didn't move. I admitted my deepest fear to the silent ground that Rachel is truly her father's daughter, in name only having inherited none of the integrity or fire that Tom carried. She had become a shadow of a person easily manipulated by a man who looked at the world as a series of marks to be fleeced. Our daughter thinks this house is just wood and plaster, Tom. She has no idea what it cost us. I felt the old prosecutor's fire rising in my chest, that cold, analytical focus that had once sent men to life sentences without me blinking an eye. I'm going to give them one last chance to be decent, Tom. Just one. But if they fail, I will dismantle their lives with the same precision I used on the Marcello crew. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my knees, and felt the mechanical click of my car door locking as I remotely armed the security system from my key fob. You might think I'm being cruel, but in a courtroom, as in life, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you can prove. I stood there for a long moment, the distant lonely caw of a crow overhead, the only witness to my closing argument. The Sterling legacy will either be earned or it will be burnt to the ground, but it will never be stolen by amateurs who think age is synonymous with infirmity. I am 68, not dead, and the law I served for 40 years still lives in my hands. I looked at my reflection in the car window, the gray hair, the sensible glasses, the mourning widow's expression, and saw the Mary Thompson mask slipping. Underneath was Veda Sterling, the woman who had lived for the hunt. I'm going to make sure justice isn't just served, it will be inescapable. When I'm done, the record will show exactly who the real predators were. I turned the ignition, the engine's roar sounding like a challenge to the encroaching dark. I would return to that house, and I would play my part, but the end game was already set in stone. I was no longer just a mother protecting her home. I was a hunter returning to the blind, waiting for the wolves to step into the clearing. I stood up, brushed the cemetery dirt from my knees, and put on my glasses. The mourning widow was gone. The federal prosecutor was back, and she was hungry for a conviction. As I drove back toward the estate, the smell of damp pine needles and fresh-cut grass clinging to my clothes, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The trap was baited, the cameras were live, and the legal barricades were in place. All that remained was the performance. I would cook their dinner, I would pour their wine, and I would listen to their lies with a smile that would look like affection, but felt like a sentence. I pulled into the driveway of the Sterling estate, the sensors picking up my car and flicking on the porch lights. It was time to start the domestic psychological warfare of Easter Eve. The actors were coming, and I was going to make sure they got exactly the ending they had earned. The kitchen didn't smell like Easter ham yet. It smelled of sterile wipes and the sharp ozone tang of high-end surveillance hardware being unboxed on a marble countertop. I stood there in the center of the Sterling estate, my hands still cool from the cemetery air, feeling the familiar weight of the Mary Thompson mask settling back into place. Yesterday I had been a widow at a grave making a final vow to a headstone. Today I was the federal prosecutor again preparing a stage for a group of actors who didn't realize they had already been cast in their own downfall. I looked at the boxes of equipment I had retrieved from Rob's secure storage. Their sleek black surfaces promising the kind of clarity that memory often lacked. I began the methodical process of unpacking my movements, fluid and devoid of the tremors a woman of my supposed fragility should possess. I was 68, but in this room with these tools, I felt the same cold efficiency that had fueled 40 years of hunting the Marcello crew. I began the theater of the ordinary unpacking groceries from Riverside Market to provide the necessary backdrop of domestic normalcy. I placed a spiral-cut ham, a bundle of fresh asparagus, and a bowl of lemons for a tart onto the counter, arranging them with the practiced eye of a woman who knew that the most successful sting operations were built on the foundation of the mundane. Tom loved his ham glazed with maple, not the cheap honey packets they sell. Now I murmured to the empty room, my voice a soft morning cadence, just in case anyone was already listening. Every onion I chop is just a distraction for what I'm really doing. I worked with the rubbing alcohol and microfiber cloths, wiping down the tiny lenses of the forensic-grade 4K cameras I had selected. These weren't standard security units. They were specifically designed to capture the microscopic dilation of pupils and the subtle facial tics of a seasoned liar. I had used this technology to identify the exact moment a mob lieutenant decided to flip, and I would use it now to watch my own daughter. Cooking for enemies is like seasoning a steak with arsenic. It looks delicious, it smells divine, but the bite you take will be your last. I moved from the kitchen to the dining room, my apron pockets heavy with the sentinels I was about to deploy. I placed a festive floral centerpiece on the long mahogany table, carefully threading a high-fidelity microphone and a wide-angle lens through the silk hydrangeas and spring lilies. The arrangement was beautiful, a symbol of life and renewal that now housed the ears and eyes of a prosecutor. I stepped back, adjusting a stem, ensuring the lens had an unobstructed view of every chair. I wouldn't miss a single glance, a single smirk, or a single drop of sweat. The Sterling estate was no longer a home. It was a sensory-rich collection chamber where every vibration would be logged and every lie would be time-stamped for the record. In the living room, I approached the mantel. I picked up a decorative ceramic rabbit, a gift from Patricia years ago, that had always sat there like a cheap, judgmental witness. I swapped it for an identical one I had commissioned, this one containing a silent motion sensor and a low-light camera. Smile for the bunny, Derek, I thought, my lips thinning into a smile that never reached my eyes. You're going to be a star. I positioned the foyer camera at eye level, hidden within the ornate frame of a landscape painting. I wanted to see the exact moment the greed took over their faces when they crossed the threshold. I wanted to see them sizing up the antiques, mentally tagging the furniture with price labels. Do you think I'm paranoid? In my world, paranoia is just another word for prepared. I've seen a man's life ended over a misunderstood glance. I'm not losing mine over a missing camera angle. Every blind spot I eliminated was a safeguard for the legacy Tom had died to protect. By late afternoon, the house was a digital fortress disguised as a grandmother's cottage. I retreated to my hidden reading room, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut with a satisfying finality. I sat before the monitors, the blue glow of the tablet screen illuminating my face in the dark. I began the calibration, watching as the grainy night vision feeds flicked into crystal clear 4K resolution. I swiped through the rooms, kitchen, dining room, living room, foyer. Everything was perfect. I tested the remote magnetic locks on the study doors, hearing the heavy metallic thunk of the bolts sliding into place from 3 rooms away. The sound was a rhythmic industrial promise of safety. I checked the sync on the high-fidelity recording pen tucked into my apron pocket, confirming the digital perimeter was closed. Systems green. I whispered, my voice sounding like a stranger's in the enclosed space. Microphones live. The house was quiet. Too quiet. It was the silence of a gallows right before the trapdoor drops. I watched the 6 empty chairs through the monitor, each one representing a person I had once tried to love, and each one now a target in an investigation that was already nearing its conclusion. The distant muffled sound of a neighbor's lawnmower was the only tether to the world outside, a reminder that the rest of Millbrook was preparing for a holiday of grace, while I was preparing for a day of reckoning. I checked the dead man's switch I had integrated into the server. If the house lost power or if a single wire was tampered with, the last 12 hours of footage would be automatically encrypted and uploaded to Rob Sterling's secure legal cloud and the local police precinct. There was no way out for them now. The stage is set. Now I just need the actors to arrive and read their lines. I looked at the monitor one last time before turning it off, the darkness of the room swallowing me whole. Tomorrow we see who is actually family and who is just a guest in their own downfall. The doorbell didn't just ring. It sounded like a starting pistol in a race where the prize was my husband's legacy, and the losers would end up in a federal penitentiary. I smoothed my apron, the fabric concealing the high-fidelity recording pen that was already live, and took a breath that tasted of ozone and expensive floral arrangements. I was no longer the hunter in the dark. I was the prey in the light, or so I needed them to believe. I pulled back the heavy oak door to find them standing on the porch like a collection of bad omens. Rachel stood in the front, her eyes darting past me as if checking the inventory of the foyer before she even stepped inside. Beside her was Derek Porter, my 44-year-old son-in-law, a man who brokered luxury cars and lived on credit, stepped into my house as if he were measuring it for a listing. He didn't even greet me. His eyes went straight to the corner of the ceiling, searching for the security hub, revealing that his goal wasn't just money, but total control of the environment. Behind them loomed the elder Porters. Warren Porter, Derek's father, 66, and smelling of cheap cigars and expensive desperation, eyed my mahogany furniture like a vulture finding a fresh kill. Patricia Porter, Derek's 64-year-old mother, moved through my foyer with a critical gaze, her fingers itching to touch the silver she believed should be hers. "Happy Easter, Mom. You look tired," Rachel said, her voice carrying that thin, manufactured veneer of concern. She barely squeezed my hand, her palm cold and damp. "It's the house, Rachel," I replied, pitching my voice into a slight, tremulous reed. "It's just so much for one person to handle alone." I offered a trembling hand to Patricia, who took it with the clinical detachment of a jeweler inspecting a flawed stone. The overpowering scent of Patricia's cloyingly sweet perfume filled the small space, a heavy artificial musk that tried to mask the rot of their financial ruin. They were all aggressively overdressed, wearing designer labels I knew they could no longer afford, clinging to the trappings of a status that had evaporated months ago. I stepped back, playing the part of the fragile widow, and watched them flood into my sanctuary. Derek brushed past me, the rough synthetic feel of his cheap suit jacket catching against my arm. He didn't look back. He was already doing a sweep of the perimeter. Have you ever seen someone look at your home and see nothing but a dollar sign? It's a special kind of insult, like being told you're already dead while you're still standing. While Rachel made half-hearted small talk about the weather and the drive up from the city, Warren and Patricia began a slow, circular walk around the foyer. The hollow metallic click of high heels on the foyer floor echoed like ticking clocks. "This wallpaper is a relic, Warren." "It needs to go," Patricia whispered, her voice carrying clearly to the microphones hidden in the crown molding. She ran a finger over the silver tray I had polished to a mirror, finish a glint of hunger in Warren's eyes, appearing as he looked at the antiques. "Solid bones, though," Warren replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "We can definitely work with this space. We could knock that wall through, open it up, modernize." They were already redecorating, already stripping the history from the walls before the bodies were even cold. Derek checked his phone incessantly, his face a mask of predatory boredom, but I saw his eyes flicking toward the keypad of the alarm system. He wanted the code. He wanted the keys. He wanted the silence of a house that couldn't testify against him. I felt a boiling indignation hidden behind my polite smile, a cold rage that I had spent 40 years refining into a weapon. They were already dividing the spoils. I was the host, and they were the parasites who had forgotten that the host can still sting. Derek interrupted his parents' appraisal, stepping into my personal space with the unearned confidence of a man who thinks he's already won. "Veda, we should really talk about your filing system," he said, his tone dripping with a condescending authority. "It's for your own safety. We need to know where you keep the important documents for the estate, just in case of an emergency. We want to help you organize." I feigned a look of confused gratitude, letting my eyes go slightly wide. "Oh, Derek, I mostly just keep things in the kitchen drawer or that old trunk upstairs." I lied, watching his eyes flare with a greedy, focused frustration. "I think there's a dusty old box in the attic, too, but I can't remember where I put the key." The lie was a hook, and I watched him swallow it whole. He glanced toward the stairs, the gears in his head turning as he calculated the best time to slip away and begin the ransack. I turned toward the dining room, gesturing for them to follow. They moved like a strike team in silk and polyester, unaware that the floor they were standing on was a trap door. I noticed how they walked past me as if I were a piece of the outdated furniture they planned to replace a ghost in my own hallways. As we reached the dining room door, Derek put a hand on my shoulder, not out of affection, but to steer me like a child, and I felt the cold, hard ridge of a heavy object in his blazer pocket. My training screamed that it was the weight of a weapon or perhaps the tools of a thief. I didn't flinch. I let him guide me the weight of the silver tray in my hands, feeling like a shield. I caught a glimpse of Rachel on the small monitor feed through my glasses, a hidden camera in the hallway capturing her leaning in to whisper to Derek. "Is he in the master bedroom?" She hissed, her voice a sharp, jagged edge in the recording. She wasn't the victim I had hoped she might be. She was the scout for the invasion. She was referring to her father's ghost or the hidden assets she believed he had left behind. She was fully complicit, a traitor in the bloodline. My heart didn't break. It hardened into a diamond. I ushered them toward the table where the centerpiece sat, waiting to record every word of their greed. The stage was set, and the first course was about to be served. The dining room was a battlefield disguised as a celebration where the fine china felt like armor, and the silver cutlery felt like sharpened stakes. As we filed into the room, I took my place at the head of the table, flanked by the empty chair I always maintained for Tom. It was a silent sentinel, a reminder of the man whose blood had built these walls. Derek took his seat with a heavy sigh, and as he sat, the cold, hard ridge in his blazer pocket clunked audibly against the mahogany wood of the chair. It was a dense metallic sound, Exhibit 1 in the trial I was already conducting in my head. I didn't let my gaze linger on his pocket. Instead, I focused on the table setting. I had spent the morning secretly switching our genuine sterling silver for high-quality plated replicas. I knew the porters. I knew their hands were prone to itching when they sat near anything of real value. If they were going to rob me tonight, they would be walking away with stainless steel disguised as a legacy. It was my first move in a game they didn't even know they were playing. "Shall we?" I asked, my voice thin and polite as I gestured for them to join hands. I led a grace that was pointedly focused on the sanctity of the home and the importance of ancestral roots. I watched through half-closed lids as Patricia and Derek exchanged bored, impatient glances. They weren't here for the blessing. They were here for the assets. "Amen," Patricia muttered, reaching for the serving spoon before the echoes of my voice had even died. The smell of rosemary and roasted ham filled the air, a scent that should have been comforting but felt cloying in the stifling atmosphere of the room. "We thank you for this house." Tom's greatest pride, I added, feeling the sharp spike of adrenaline in my chest. "And for the family gathered within it, whether they belong here or not." Derek's jaw tightened, and he caught the high-pitched ring of a crystal glass being struck as he shifted in his seat. "Can we just eat Veda?" he asked, his tone dripping with a dismissive arrogance. "The ham is getting cold." As the meal progressed, the facade of polite guests began to crumble faster than the crust on the lemon tart. Patricia took a sip of the vintage champagne, the good stuff, because I wanted their inhibitions lowered, and began a detailed critique of the local tax codes. "Millbrook taxes are astronomical, Veda," she said, her voice a sharp rasp that grated on my nerves. "You're practically flushing money down the drain just to keep these empty rooms warm." I poked at my asparagus, playing the role of the overwhelmed widow. "It is a bit much," I whispered, letting a fake tremor touch my hand. Warren chimed in, his scratchy throat clearing, sounding like gravel in a blender. "And the garden, Veda. That rose garden is a burden. Tom's roses are lovely, but the maintenance cost is a sinkhole. It would be better paved over for a larger driveway or perhaps a modern guest house, something that adds actual utility. Do you know why I keep an empty chair for Tom? It's not because I'm crazy. It's because I want him to have a front row seat to the moment his daughter sells his soul for a tax break." I looked at Rachel, hoping to find a flicker of protest in her eyes, but she was busy avoiding my gaze, her fork scraping against her plate with a rhythmic, anxious persistence. A smaller condo in a managed community would be so much safer for a woman of your vintage, Patricia added, her smile not reaching her cold, appraising eyes. I felt a cold fury rising within me, a sharp contrast to the feigned helplessness I projected. They were carving up the estate while I was still breathing, treating my life's work like a clearance sale. I took another sip of wine, watching the way the light caught the dilation of Derek's pupils as the alcohol took hold. He was getting bold. He was getting hungry. Listen to that. The sound of a silver fork on a porcelain plate. It's the sound of civilized people, isn't it? But if you listen closer, you'll hear the sound of wolves sharpening their teeth. Derek finished his third glass of champagne and set it down with a force that made the liquid slosh over the rim. He leaned forward, his bloodshot eyes fixed on me, dropping all pretense of Easter dinner. The air in the room became heavy, a tangible weight that made it hard to breathe. "Let's be real, Veda," he said, his voice dropping into a menacing register. "We know about the cancer bills. We know the bank is breathing down your neck. There's no point in keeping up this charade. You're broke, and this house is going to be seized unless we intervene." I felt the cold, slick feel of the forged mortgage statement he hadn't produced yet but was clearly referencing. It was a lie, of course. Tom had left me more than comfortable, but Derek had spent months creating a paper trail of fake debts to gaslight me into surrendering. "I managed Derek," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Tom made sure I was looked after. The conversation was a noose, and the porters were taking turns tightening the knot, while I smiled and asked for more gravy. He scoffed a jagged, ugly sound. "Looked after Veda, you're drowning, and you're too proud to grab the life raft we're offering." He set his fork down with a sharp, calculated clink that silenced the table. It was the sound of a closing door. He didn't just set his fork down, he threw down a gauntlet. I watched him reach into his blazer pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, and pull out the heavy object I had felt earlier. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense, but in his hands it was just as lethal. He slid a folded legal document across the table toward me, the paper rasping against the tablecloth like a snake in dry grass. I recognized the letterhead immediately. It was a mortgage default notice, a masterfully executed forgery designed to look like a final warning from the bank. It was his ultimatum: sign the house over to the Porter Management Trust or lose it to the state. I stared at the document, my heart turning into a cold, hard stone. The trap I had set was finally being walked into, but the weight of their betrayal was heavier than I had expected. I didn't need a law degree to recognize the document Derek slid across the table. It was a quitclaim deed, the legal equivalent of a white flag he expected me to wave over my own grave. The dry, rasping sound of the document sliding over the heavy damask tablecloth echoed in the sudden silence of the dining room. I didn't reach for it. I simply watched it come to rest near my wine glass, the bitter taste of the expensive champagne turning sour in my mouth as I realized the depth of the betrayal sitting across from me. Derek leaned forward, his eyes bright with a manic, unearned triumph. He had dropped all pretense of being the grieving son-in-law. Now he was the foreman of a demolition crew, and I was the structure he was eager to tear down. "It's for your own good, Veda," he said, his voice smooth and oily like a cheap mechanic trying to sell a lemon. "You're 70. You shouldn't be worrying about property taxes, leaky roofs, and complex maintenance. Rachel and I have talked about it. We've even consulted with a specialist, a doctor. Miles Cunningham, who agrees that the stress of managing an estate like this is taking a visible toll on your cognitive health. We need you to sign this deed transferring the Sterling estate to us immediately." My knuckles whitened as I gripped my napkin under the table. "I'm 68, Derek," I replied, my voice a low-level thrum of controlled thunder. "And I've never forgotten a single thing that mattered." He didn't flinch. He had clearly rehearsed this, probably in front of a mirror while wearing the suit Tom had bought him for his wedding. He began detailing a list of my supposed failures, instances of forgetfulness. I knew he had fabricated missed calls that never happened. Bills he claimed were overdue that I had paid months ago. I realized then that he hadn't just snapped today. He had been building a case for my incompetence for months, weaving a web of lies to ensnare Rachel and justify this theft. Have you ever watched a person's soul rot in real time? It starts at the eyes and moves to the mouth. Derek was already a corpse. He just didn't know it yet. I looked at the vein throbbing in his temple, a jagged blue line that betrayed the rage simmering beneath his faux concern. He wasn't just suggesting a change in management, he was demanding a surrender. He revealed that he had already discussed an involuntary psychiatric hold with this doctor. Cunningham, a threat hidden behind a smile. Sign the paper, or we let the professionals decide where you spend your twilight years. Warren and Patricia didn't miss a beat, chiming in like a well-trained choir of vultures. They began describing the luxury of the guest rooms they had already mentally claimed as their permanent residence. Patricia even had the gall to suggest that I move into the smaller downstairs study to avoid the stairs, noting that it would be so much easier for the nurses to reach me there. "Rachel is worried sick about you alone in this mausoleum," Veda Warren added, his scratchy voice sounding like dry leaves on a tombstone. "Don't be selfish. Think of your daughter." I turned my head slowly toward Rachel. She was staring fixedly at her wine, her fingers trembling as they traced the rim of her glass. She wouldn't look at me. She just nodded mutely when Derek's hand found hers on the table. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a display of ownership, a master showing off his hound. Do you know what happens when you tell a narcissist no? It's not an argument. It's a declaration of war. And I've always been better at winning wars than making peace. Is that true, Rachel? I asked, my voice cutting through the porter's chatter like a cold blade. Are you worried about me, or are you worried about Derek's bookies? The room went cold. Not the cold of an open window, but the cold of a tomb being sealed from the outside. The sharp, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to grow louder, counting down the seconds of their remaining welcome. I pushed the quitclaim deed back across the table with the tip of my finger, the paper feeling like a poisonous snake. "The answer is no," I said, dropping my voice to the low, terrifying register I had used when staring down Marcello's hitmen in a federal safe house. "Not today, not when I'm dead, and certainly not to a man who can't even look me in the eye without a price tag in his head. You will never live under this roof, and you will never touch a cent of Tom's legacy." Derek's face transformed. The mask of the concerned son-in-law shattered, revealing a pure, malignant, narcissistic rage that turned his skin a blotchy, ugly red. "You have no idea what you just did, you old fool!" He spat, his voice trembling with the effort to keep from screaming. I sat perfectly still as he stood up the chair, screeching against the floor. The smell of the cooling ham fat congealing on the platter seemed to fill the room, a greasy, dying scent. I realized then that the heavy object I had felt in his pocket earlier wasn't a weapon, at least it hadn't started as one. It was the very champagne flute he was now gripping with a white-knuckled intensity. He had intended to use it for a celebratory toast to his new kingdom, but now it was a weapon of opportunity. I saw his knuckles turn white around the stem of the flute, his eyes narrowing into two dark slits of pure, unadulterated hatred, and I knew the time for talking had officially ended. I was no longer a mother at a dinner table. I was a predator who had finally cornered her prey, waiting for the first strike that would give me the mandate to destroy him. I didn't blink when the crystal flute left Derek's hand. I had spent 40 years watching cowards try to strike from the shadows, but I never expected my own son-in-law to do it in broad daylight. The sound of the champagne flute glass beginning to stress under Derek's grip had been the only warning, a microscopic screech of crystalline protest before the stem finally snapped. In that heartbeat, the world slowed down the way it always did for me when the stakes shifted from legal to physical. Through the haze of my training, I saw the trajectory of the glass before it even cleared the table. My reflexes, honed by years of surviving the worst the Marcello family could throw at me, told me I could easily catch it or simply lean 2 inches to the left. But I chose neither. I stood perfectly still, a calculated target. I didn't move in time, knowing the evidence would speak louder than any defense he could raise. It was a tactical sacrifice, a piece of flesh for a guaranteed conviction. Rachel's voice cut through the tension, first high and desperate. "She's so selfish," she screamed, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "He has empty bedrooms. Empty rooms while we're losing everything." Derek hurled the flute with a guttural, primal scream of, "You old witch!" The crystal shattered against my right cheekbone with a sickening, wet crunch. I felt the sharp, stinging heat of the cut as it opened, followed immediately by the sticky, sweet smell of spilled champagne and the heavy, metallic scent of my own blood. The spray of red dashed across my face and the white lace tablecloth, a jagged Rorschach test of his unraveling. The room plunged into a horrific, ringing silence as the reality of the assault sank in. Derek stood there, his chest heaving, his arm still outstretched, his eyes wide with a sudden flickering terror of what he had unleashed. Rachel gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her face a mask of disbelief. You think you can just say no to us, Derek spat, though the venom in his voice was now laced with the tremors of a man who realized he had crossed a line he couldn't walk back. After everything we've sacrificed for you, I didn't scream. I didn't even flinch. I simply looked at the shards on the floor and then back at him. Look at what you've done, Derek. I said, my voice as cold and clinical as a morgue slab. You just finished the case for me. Blood is warmer than wine. It has a metallic tang that cuts through the scent of rosemary and maple glaze like a siren through a Sunday morning. While Rachel began to hyperventilate, her breath coming in short, jagged hitches, Patricia and Warren sat frozen like wax figures in a museum of greed. They looked at the blood dripping onto my blouse and then at their son, the implications of the next few minutes beginning to settle in their parasitic minds. I reached slowly into my apron pocket, my movements deliberate and steady. I pulled out a crisp white linen napkin and pressed it to the jagged cut on my face. The white fabric turned a deep blossoming crimson instantly. I looked directly into Derek's terrified eyes and let a small predatory smile touch the corners of my mouth, the look of an investigator who just secured a signed confession. "Mom, please." Rachel sobbed, her mascara beginning to run down her pale face in ugly black streaks. "He didn't mean it. It was an accident. He's just stressed." I stood up, the movement full of a quiet, terrifying authority that silenced her mid-sentence. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice low and vibrating with a power they hadn't seen before. "Now, before I decide to stop being family and start being a federal officer. Do you want to know the secret to winning a fight you're physically destined to lose? You don't fight the man. You fight the evidence. You let him hand you his own handcuffs." They scrambled then, a chaotic flurry of silk and polyester, as they realized the theater of the lonely widow was over. Derek tried to reach for the document he had slid across the table, but I pinned it to the wood with one finger, my gaze never leaving his. "Leave it," I commanded. He recoiled as if the paper were red hot. I watched them retreat, stumbling over their own feet in their haste to reach the foyer. I didn't follow them immediately. I stood at the head of the table, the matriarch of a ruined feast, and breathed in the silence. It was the smell of a victory that tasted like copper and old champagne. I picked up the high-speed camera disguised in the floral centerpiece, its tiny red light blinking a steady, rhythmic green. It had captured the exact angle of the throw, the malice in his face, and the lack of provocation. No judge in the country would buy a story about me tripping. I shuffled toward the foyer, maintaining the deliberate, slow gait of an injured senior, but my internal focus was a laser. I picked up my car keys and ensured the high-fidelity recording pen in my pocket was still functioning. As I stepped onto the porch, I could hear them inside, their voices rising in a frantic, panicked cacophony. "We'll say she fell," Warren hissed. "We'll tell them she's senile and got combative." Patricia was already talking about cleaning up the glass, her voice a shrill, desperate whine. I ignored them. I walked to my car, the cold evening air biting at the open wound on my face. "I hope you all enjoyed the ham," I whispered to the shadows of the house. "It's the last meal you'll ever have under my roof." They thought I was fleeing in fear. They thought the old lady was running to hide. But a prosecutor doesn't run from a crime scene, she goes to file the report. I got into the driver's seat, the cold, vibrating hum of the car engine, a comfort against the silence of the estate. I pulled out my phone and sent a 3-word text to Rob Sterling, Phase 1 complete. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw them huddled on the porch like a pack of rats in a sinking ship, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt Tom's hand on my shoulder, steady and proud. The triage nurse didn't see a victim. She saw a crime scene in a silk blouse, and that was exactly how I intended to present myself to the record. I pulled into the ambulance bay of Millbrook Regional Medical Center, the engine idling for a moment as I checked my reflection. The white napkin was now a heavy, sodden weight of crimson against my cheek. I felt the rhythmic sound of my heart beating in my ears, a steady, cold cadence that ignored the sharp, stinging heat of the wound. I stepped out of the car, refusing the immediate offer of a wheelchair from an orderly. I needed to maintain the image of a woman in full possession of her faculties, even as blood dripped onto the linoleum floor. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale coffee and industrial floor wax, the universal scent of institutional crisis. I walked to the desk, my voice level and authoritative. "My name is Veda Sterling," I said. "I have been assaulted with a dangerous object. I require medical attention and a forensic kit." I was led into an examination room where I met Dr. Sarah Jenkins, a trauma resident with eyes that had seen too many accidental falls, looked at my wound with a skepticism that made me want to hire her on the spot. She reached for a sterile wipe, but I caught her wrist. "Not yet, doctor," I said. "I need the angle of the glass impact documented for the report. I need photographs of the wound and the wine splatter pattern on my clothing before you touch it." Dr. Jenkins paused, her eyebrows climbing toward her hairline. "This isn't a fall, Sarah," I continued, using her name to establish a professional parody. "This is an assault with a dangerous object." She nodded, the skepticism in her eyes shifting into a grim understanding. She called for the hospital's forensic camera. The blinding white-blue flash of the lens filled the room repeatedly, capturing the jagged edges of the cut and the way the dried champagne had matted my hair. I sat perfectly still, enduring the sharp antiseptic sting when she finally began to clean the site. I had survived cross-examinations from mob lawyers. 8 stitches without local anesthetic was a walk in the park. Do you know what the most beautiful thing in a courtroom is? It's not the law. It's a time-stamped, high-resolution photograph of a lie. While Dr. Jenkins finished her work, I insisted on paying the bill. I reached into my bag and pulled out a stack of hundreds, paying for the ER visit entirely in cash. I saw the flash of confusion on the administrator's face, but I didn't offer an explanation. I needed to ensure there was no digital footprint of my location, no credit card pings, no insurance claims that could be accessed by a desperate son-in-law with a penchant for social engineering. I was vanishing into the system, becoming a ghost while my predators were still celebrating their kill. By the time Officer Jeffries arrived, I was bandaged and ready. Officer Jeffries was a veteran of the Millbrook Force, a man whose notepad was a graveyard for domestic disputes and broken promises. He sat by my bed, his pen poised over the paper with a weary expectation. I shifted my tone, then adopting a slightly more fragile, hesitant cadence. I became the protective mother, a woman deeply saddened by a family dispute that got out of hand. "He's my son-in-law officer," I whispered, letting my gaze drop to my lap. "I'm sure he didn't mean to snap like that. Things just got heated over Easter dinner." I gave a statement that was technically accurate in every detail, but framed with a soft focus lens of maternal denial. I knew exactly what I was doing. If I came on too strong, the porters might lawyer up immediately. But if I played the wavering victim, they would feel emboldened. They would think they could talk their way out of it. "I'm just going to stay with a friend tonight," I told Jeffries. "I don't feel safe going back just yet." I was the bait, and the hook was already buried deep in Derek's throat. All I had to do now was let him think he was swimming away. Rob Sterling arrived an hour later, his face a mask of controlled fury that matched my own. He didn't take me to his home. We'd already prepared a suite at the Fairmont under a corporate alias. Once inside Hotel Suite 804, I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out the master tablet. The smooth, cool glass of the screen came to life, showing the interior of my dining room. It was nearly 10 a.m. on Monday morning. We watched in silence as the foyer feed showed Officer Jeffries and another man, Officer Miller, knocking on the front door. Derek answered, his face a masterpiece of faux distress. We could hear everything through the high-fidelity microphones I'd hidden in the crown molding. "Officers, thank God you're here," Derek said, his voice crackling through the tablet speakers. "We've been frantic. My mother-in-law, she had a spell. She tripped and hit the sideboard. She became quite confused and drove off before we could stop her. She's been showing signs of dementia for months." Watching them on that screen felt like watching a slow-motion car crash, except I was the one who had greased the tracks. I watched Rachel stand behind him, her head nodding in a synchronized lie, her eyes averted from the officers' body cams. They were building their own gallows, one perjured sentence at a time. The audio feed captured Derek laughing after the police left the sound tinny but unmistakable. The old woman's dementia just handed us the keys to the kingdom, he told Rachel, pouring a fresh glass of Tom's best scotch. He had no remorse, no hesitation. He was already spending the money I hadn't lost. "There it is, Rob," I said, my voice cold and satisfied. "They're not just liars, they're felons now. They just committed perjury on a police body cam. This is the nail in the coffin." Rob leaned over the monitor, his voice grim. "Gabe, look at Derek's phone. He's making a call. I think he's trying to move the timeline up to tonight." I watched Derek's thumb hover over his phone screen on the monitor, his face twisted into the smug grin of a man who thought he had just inherited the world. While I sat in a hotel room 3 miles away holding the detonator, the previous night's digital trail had led us here to this specific moment of desperate ambition. Beside me, Rob Sterling leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the live feed of my mahogany desk back at the estate. We were watching a crime in real-time high definition and crystal clear. Derek wasn't just making a call. He was performing an autopsy on my life, or at least the version of it he thought existed. He picked up the landline, his posture radiating a predatory confidence that made my stomach churn with a familiar clinical disgust. He began to speak, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hotel's air conditioning. Derek adopted a voice that was a grotesque, high-pitched imitation of a frail, confused woman. He was claiming to be me, Veda Sterling, citing a sudden mental fog for wanting to transfer all my liquid assets into a new joint account with his name on it. "Look at him, Rob," I whispered, my voice a jagged edge. "He's been practicing that voice. He didn't just snap on Sunday. He's been auditioning for this role for years." I watched him discard his dignity for a chance at my wallet, noting the way his eyes darted around the room, as if the walls themselves might testify against him. The bank representative on the other end of the line was trained for this, alerted by the specific red flag protocols Rob and I had established weeks ago. I heard the static-filled crackle of the speakerphone as the agent asked for the secondary security phrase. Derek paused his smugness, flickering for a fraction of a second. He looked toward Rachel, who was frantically rifling through Tom's old desk drawers, throwing papers and stationery onto the floor in a desperate search for a clue. She knew about the debt, $180,000 for a fake business loan, $140,000 for his gambling habit, and $110,000 Derek had quietly funneled to someone Rachel didn't know existed. The sight of my daughter assisting in this identity theft felt like a physical blow to my sternum, but I forced myself to stay detached, to remain the prosecutor. Have you ever heard the sound of a man's future evaporating? It sounds a lot like the silence on the other end of a recorded bank line. After a long, agonizing 10 seconds, Derek's eyes lit up. "Emily, 1955, he barked into the receiver. It was my mother's name and birth year. A guess based on a photo album he'd probably seen in the attic. The system accepted it not because it was my master key, but because it was the specific trigger for the bait account." The bait was taken. Rob muttered, his hand tightening on the edge of the tablet. "He's in the shallow end of the pool now." What Derek didn't know, what he couldn't possibly conceive, was that the account he had just accessed was a digital cage. It was a forensic trap pre-flagged through a financial fraud alert system coordinated with federal contacts. By attempting an unauthorized wire transfer under a false identity, Derek had just triggered a serious financial fraud violation, one that could escalate to federal charges. I watched his face on the screen, seeing the beads of sweat beginning to pool on his upper lip. He felt the wind coming. He could practically taste the millions he thought Tom had hidden away. Why did I choose $173? Because it was the exact amount of the first paycheck Tom ever earned. A little piece of poetry for the man who was about to lose everything. It was a symbolic pittance, a reminder of the honest work Derek had never bothered to understand. He asked the representative for the total available balance for an immediate wire transfer. He leaned in close to the desk, his eyes wide and hungry, his sweaty palm prints leaving dull smears on the polished mahogany. The representative's voice came through the speaker, calm and professional. "The current balance is $173, sir." The transition on Derek's face was spectacular. The color didn't just leave his skin, it was replaced by a sickly, blotched red that made him look like a man having a stroke. 173. He screamed at the phone, his fake Veda voice vanishing instantly. "There should be millions. Where is the Marcello money? You're stealing from me. You're all thieves." He slammed the phone down so hard the plastic casing shattered, the shards skittering across the desk. Rachel collapsed into the armchair behind him, her face a mask of catastrophic realization. The $430,000 emergency fund she thought would save them was a ghost, a fiction created by Derek's own delusions. Panic is a funny thing. It makes a smart man stupid and a stupid man dangerous. Derek was currently becoming both. He looked around the office, his chest heaving, realizing that the men he owed money to in Miami didn't take excuses, and they certainly didn't take $173. He stood there in the center of my sanctuary, a cornered rat, realizing the walls were closing in. He revealed the true depth of his madness, then shouting at Rachel that I must have hidden the mob kickbacks somewhere else in the house. His greed wasn't just about the estate. It was fueled by a delusional conspiracy theory that Tom and I were sitting on a mountain of illegal cash from the Marcello prosecution. He grabbed Tom's favorite antique lamp, the one with the green glass shade that had illuminated 40 years of late-night legal briefs, and hurled it against the office window. The sound of the glass breaking was like a gunshot in the hotel room. Derek's eyes narrowed as they landed on the floorboard. He had missed the one that didn't creak when he stepped on it earlier. He lunged for a heavy letter opener on the desk, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. I watched him drop to his knees and begin to pry at the wood, his fingers bleeding, as he sought the secret he was sure was buried beneath. I didn't turn away. I watched the man my daughter loved become a common thief, knowing that every splinter of wood he broke was another nail in his coffin. The antique mahogany groaned as Derek jammed a letter opener into the gap of the floorboard, his face slick with the kind of sweat you only see on men who know they are running out of time. I watched the live feed from the hotel room, the screen casting a cold artificial blue light over my features, as the sound of floorboard splintering echoed through the speakers. Derek wasn't just searching for money anymore. He was a scavenger picking through the bones of a life he never bothered to understand. Beside me, Rob remained silent, his gaze fixed on the monitor where my daughter Rachel stood like a porcelain doll in a windstorm, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrible clarity. Every crack of the wood felt like a physical strike against the history of this house, but I didn't flinch. I had left that floorboard loose for a reason. I had baited the trap with the truth, knowing Derek's greed would never allow him to walk away from a secret. With a final desperate grunt, Derek pried the wood back. He didn't find the stacks of mob cash or the bearer bonds he had fantasized about. Instead, he pulled out a vacuum-sealed leather portfolio thick with the weight of official business. I watched his trembling hands as he fumbled with the seal, the crinkle of the plastic loud in the quiet study. He pulled out a set of credentials, gold-embossed leather containing a photograph of me younger and sharper, and the official seal of the Department of Justice. The name on the ID wasn't Veda Sterling. It was Mary Thompson, federal prosecutor. Beneath the ID lay a witness protection placement order dated 1999 and a series of redacted documents detailing the dismantling of the Marcello organization. Mary Thompson. Derek stammered, his voice a thin, shaky reed. Rachel, who the hell is Mary Thompson? Rachel reached out her fingers, grazing the redacted pages, her face turning a ghostly white as she recognized the sharp, slanted script in the margins. That is my mother's handwriting, Derek, she whispered. She wasn't just a lawyer, she was a hunter. Have you ever seen a man realize he's been playing checkers against a grandmaster who already has him in checkmate? The look on Derek's face was worth every cent I spent on the cameras. The realization hit Derek like a physical blow, transforming his predatory smugness into a frantic, cornered animal panic. He began pacing the small space of the study, his boots crunching over the fragments of the antique lamp he had destroyed. His mind, always looking for a shortcut or a bribe, immediately leaped to the worst possible conclusion. "She's not a victim, Rachel," he shouted, his voice cracking with a stifled paranoia. "She's a Fed. Everything she's done since Easter dinner has been a setup." He grabbed the documents, holding them like they were toxic, his eyes darting toward the ceiling as if he could finally see the pinhole lenses tracking his every move. He assumed the documents were leverage he could use to blackmail me into silence about the assault. He believed that if he could find the physical deeds to the trust or the proof of my real assets, he could still force a stalemate. Rachel, however, was beginning to understand the scale of their mistake. She saw the precision of the trap. Why would I leave my real identity in a floorboard because a cornered rat doesn't look for a way out, it looks for a weapon? And I just handed him a gun that I knew would misfire. "We need to leave, Derek," Rachel said, her voice hollow and devoid of its usual petulance. "We need to leave right now." She looked around the study, seeing the ghosts of her childhood being replaced by the clinical reality of an investigation. But Derek wasn't ready to fold. The debt in Miami was a noose that was only getting tighter. And the discovery of my true identity had convinced him that the real treasure, the Marcello money he was sure I'd stolen, must be in the wall safe. "We come back at 11, he hissed, leaning in close to Rachel until their foreheads almost touched. "We use the spare key. Veda is still at her friend's house. She thinks she's safe there. We'll get the safe open, and if it won't budge, we take the whole damn thing out of the wall." He was doubling down on a losing hand fueled by a delusion that was more powerful than his fear. The front door clicked shut a few minutes later, the hollow sound echoing through the house. The estate was empty, but the air was still thick with the smell of their greed. I watched them pull away in the SUV through the perimeter cameras, their headlights cutting a twin path of desperation through the dark. In the hotel suite, the silence was absolute until I reached out and tapped the master tablet. As Derek's car pulled away, I turned to Rob and held up the monitor. "They're coming back for the safe at midnight, Rob. They think they found my weakness, but they've only found the entrance to the maze." I had intentionally left those floorboards loose and the WITSEC documents hidden there to force them into a second, more serious crime. A simple family dispute could be buried, but a planned nighttime burglary of a protected federal witness was a serious felony that could carry significant prison time. "Call the detectives," I said, my voice as cold as the granite I had stood by in the cemetery. "I want the audience ready for the final act." I felt no pity as I watched the empty foyer on the screen. The mother who would have protected Rachel was gone, replaced by the prosecutor who had spent 40 years ensuring that every action had an equal and opposite consequence. You might think I am being cruel, but I have seen the world without rules. Tonight, the rules were going to be the only thing left standing. The front door was locked, the cameras were live, and the clock was ticking toward a midnight that would change everything. The back door didn't put up a fight. It yielded with a soft, mechanical click that sounded like a trapdoor being armed in the dead of night. I sat in the darkness of the secure hotel suite, the master tablet resting on my lap, its blue light reflecting in my glasses. Beside me, Rob was a silent statue, his eyes fixed on the secondary monitor. We watched as the Porter family breached the threshold at exactly 11:08 p.m. Derek led the way, his movements jerky and frantic, wielding a flashlight like a weapon. Rachel followed her shadow, stretching long and distorted across the kitchen tiles. Behind them, Warren and Patricia moved with a practiced predatory quiet that chilled me more than Derek's incompetence ever could. They didn't look like family members entering a home. They looked like a tactical team clearing a high-value target. Flashlights down. Derek hissed, his voice a distorted rasp through the high-fidelity microphones. "We don't want the neighbors calling the cops before we find the deeds." I watched Rachel hesitate, her hand lingering on the doorframe. "I feel like a ghost in my own childhood home, Derek," she whispered. He didn't even turn around. He just barked an order for Patricia and Warren to head upstairs while he began a sweep of the lower floor. There is no sound more offensive than a stranger's laughter in a room where your husband died. On the monitor, Patricia and Warren entered my master bedroom, the one room I had kept exactly as it was the day Tom passed. They didn't pause to respect the silence. Patricia immediately began dumping my jewelry boxes onto the handmade quilt, the velvet cases hitting the bed with soft, rhythmic thuds. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a jeweler's loupe, revealing that this wasn't just a desperate search for documents, but a premeditated raid of my most personal valuables. "Look at these pearls, Warren," she said, her voice dripping with a casual, terrifying greed. "She probably hasn't worn them since the 90s. They're wasted on her." I watched her pocket my mother's antique pearls and then Tom's gold wedding ring, which I had kept on the nightstand. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the edges of the tablet, my prosecutor's mind logging each stolen item as a separate count of grand larceny. Warren was just as thorough, tearing through the closet and tossing Tom's old suits onto the floor with a grunt of worthless rags. He was looking for cash sewn into the linings, treating my husband's memory like a landfill. Have you ever watched someone steal your memories? They don't look like monsters when they do it. They just look like shoppers at a clearance sale. Rachel entered the bedroom a moment later, her flashlight beam dancing erratically across the ceiling. She stopped when she saw her father's reading glasses lying on the carpet where Warren had carelessly brushed them aside. For a second, a brief, sharp flash of genuine remorse crossed her face. She reached down to pick them up, her fingers trembling. "Dad?" "He loved these glasses," she murmured. "Do we really have to do this?" Derek appeared in the doorway, his face slick with sweat and his eyes wild. "Unless you want to explain to the men in Miami why we don't have their money. Yes, we really have to do this," he snapped. He didn't see the glasses. He only saw the $430,000 debt that was currently acting as a noose around his neck. I watched the moral collapse happen in real time. Rachel's hand hovered over the glasses for a heartbeat longer before the weight of Derek's pressure crushed what was left of her conscience. She dropped them back onto the floor, not gently, but with a sense of finality that made my heart harden into a cold, unbreakable stone. "And you think I should have called the cops then, no? In my experience, you don't arrest a thief when he's just looking, you wait until his pockets are full." I leaned closer to the screen, watching Patricia stuff a pair of diamond earrings into her blazer. I had intentionally placed Tom's ring and those pearls in plain sight, knowing that their emotional value would act as the perfect bait. I needed them to commit to the act to move beyond trespassing into the realm of grand larceny, with premeditated intent to deprive. They were following my script perfectly. Every item they took was another year added to a potential sentence, another piece of evidence for the audience I was preparing for the final act. I felt a surge of cold, clinical satisfaction. They thought they were clearing out a defenseless widow's nest, unaware that every breath they took was being recorded in 4K resolution and synced to a secure legal cloud 3 miles away. The smell of the lavender sachet from my dresser clashing with the sweat of the intruders came back to me in memory, a sensory ghost that made the violation feel even more intimate. Rachel's hand hovered over my reading glasses on the nightstand one last time, but as Derek barked her name from the hall, she dropped them like they were red hot and followed him toward the study. They moved with a renewed, frantic energy drawn by the lure of the wall safe they were convinced held the physical deeds and the Marcello millions. The master bedroom was left in ruins, mattress flip drawers emptied, and Tom's suits trampled underfoot. As they exited, I saw the low electric hum of the surveillance cameras tracking their movement with a robotic precision. They were heading toward the safe that held the final ruin of Rachel's soul, a steel box that contained nothing but the evidence of their own downfall. I turned to Rob, my face unreadable. "They're going for the safe," I said, my voice as level as a judge's verdict. It was time to close the trap. The family I had raised was gone, replaced by a gallery of defendants, and I was ready to begin the final cross-examination. I adjusted the volume on the tablet, waiting for the sound I knew was coming, the frustrated metallic clicking of the safe keypad as Derek realized that some doors stay closed for a reason. Derek didn't care about the poetry in Tom's books. He only cared about the steel door they hid his fingers trembling as he swept the worthless literature onto the floor to reach the keypad. The frustrated metallic clicking of the safe keypad echoed through the study, a frantic rhythm that betrayed his escalating panic. From my vantage point behind the monitors, I watched his face contort in the green-tinted infrared glow. He was sweat-streaked and desperate, a man who had already spent the money he hadn't yet stolen. I adjusted the volume on the master control, activating the military-grade audio override system I had installed during the house's last security overhaul. It allowed me to project my voice with zero lag, turning every room in the Sterling estate into a potential interrogation chamber. I wasn't just watching them, I was presiding over their final moments of freedom. Derek punched in a sequence my birthday and was met with a sharp red light rejection and a mocking beep, beep, beep. He growled a low animal sound and turned his fury on Rachel. Think Rachel. What was his lucky number? What was the date of that stupid rose show he won? He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin with a strength that made her wince. I watched her through the lens, my jaw tightening. I don't know Derek. He never told me? You're hurting my arm. She was weeping now, her face a mask of blotchy misery. But even in her pain, she looked remarkably like the defendants I used to break on the stand. She was looking for an exit that didn't exist. Have you ever wondered what your value is to someone who claims to love you? It's usually found in the things they remember when you aren't looking. For Rachel, Tom was just a bank account with a heartbeat, a source of guilt she had spent years trying to drown in luxury purchases. Now that guilt was manifesting as a total cognitive blackout. Derek tried the anniversary date from the foyer portrait next. Red light, beep, rejection. The smell of old paper and dust rose from the floor where Tom's first editions lay like fallen soldiers, their spines cracked by Derek's boots. Warren stepped closer, his own greed, making him bold enough to offer a suggestion. It has to be his birthday, he rasped. Men like Tom are creatures of habit. They use the dates that define them. A horrific silence fell over the room, then one so heavy it seemed to dampen the sound of the ticking clock in the hall. Rachel stared at the keypad, her hand hovering in the air, but her mind was wiped clean. She began to stammer through the months, her eyes darting toward the ceiling, as if looking for the answer written in the shadows. It was June. Or maybe July. God, I was at camp that year, I don't remember. I sat in the darkness of the secure room, feeling a final, cold snap in my heart. 42 years on this earth. Rachel, and you can't even remember the day the man who built your life was born. Rachel's memory was like an old, moth-eaten sweater full of holes where the important parts used to be. She had traded the substance of her father's life for the surface of Derek's lies, and now, standing at the threshold of the vault, she was empty-handed. Derek's patience evaporated. He reached into his tool bag and pulled out a heavy pry bar, the steel glinting in the narrow beam of his flashlight. He jammed the tip into the gap between the safe and the mahogany paneling, his muscles bunching as he prepared to use brute force. That was the trigger. I pressed the master override on my tablet. The study's lights flickered once, twice, and then died, completely plunging the porters into an absolute suffocating darkness. The heavy mahogany doors to the study slammed shut with a thunderous mechanical thud that echoed through the house like a cannon blast. The mechanical whine of the magnetic bolts sliding into the door frame followed, immediately sealing the exit. Click, thud, silence. To me, the sound of a trap closing is the loudest noise in the world, especially when you're the one inside it. I watched the infrared feed of their panicked, huddling shapes, Derek lunging for the door handle and finding it as solid as a cliff face, Patricia screaming into the dark, Warren stumbling over the discarded books. In the sudden pitch-black silence, I toggled the intercom. The speaker on the desk crackled to life, and my voice filled the room crystal clear and stripped of all maternal warmth. The security system has locked down the room until authorities arrive. I watched them freeze their heads, turning toward the source of the sound like spooked cattle. "Are you looking for the code, Rachel?" I continued, my voice echoing off the paneled walls. "It's 0605, June 5th. The day you forgot every single year. The day your father waited for a phone call that never came while you were at that resort in Cabo." I felt a surge of predatory power as I watched them realize I wasn't miles away in a hotel. I was the ghost in the machine. Derek began to pound on the door, his screams of "let us out," sounding pathetic against the reinforced oak. He didn't know that the safe was linked to a silent alarm routed through a private security service, which had already alerted local law enforcement. They were already turning into the driveway. I watched the infrared feed of their panicked, huddling shapes and pressed the button to open the hidden partition. "Did you really think I'd leave my life in a box you could steal?" I asked, the words cutting through their frantic whispers like a blade. The sudden absolute cold of the air conditioning kicking into lockdown mode made their breath visible in the dark. They were trapped in a tomb of their own making, surrounded by the books they couldn't read and the legacy they couldn't honor. I stood up from my chair, my bandaged face casting a sharp shadow against the bank of monitors. The game of Mary Thompson was over. The hunt of Veda Sterling had reached its conclusion. I stepped toward the hidden door in the study wall, the pneumatic hiss of the bookshelf sliding open, promising a face-to-face confrontation they would never forget. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was the evidence, the judge, and the executioner, and I was stepping into the light to finish what they had started. The mahogany bookshelf didn't just slide, it exhaled a pneumatic hiss that sounded like the final breath of my daughter's freedom. For days, I had lived within the marrow of this house, existing in the negative space the porters never thought to check. They had marched through the hallways as if they owned the air, never suspecting that the reinforced reading room, the bunker Tom and I had built during the Marcello threats, was more than a mere closet. I had been 10 feet away the entire time, watching through one-way glass and listening to every treacherous heartbeat. Now the partition retracted and the pitch-black study was violated by the sharp artificial glare of the hallway lights. I stepped out first, my silhouette cutting through the dust motes like a blade. The bandage on my cheek was a physical record of the moment Derek transitioned from a son-in-law to a lead defendant. Behind me, Rob Sterling followed his face, a mask of judicial iron flanked by the two plainclothes detectives I had invited to witness the end of a dynasty. Detective Miller, a man with a jaw like an anvil and eyes that had seen every low-rent crime in the county, stepped out with his badge, catching the light. Beside him was Detective Sanchez, younger and leaner, his hand resting with practiced ease on the zip ties at his belt. The effect on the porters was instantaneous. Derek, who had been hunched over the safe like a starving dog, recoiled so violently he tripped over the very books he had desecrated. His heavy pry bar hit the hardwood with a ringing clang. Rachel let out a choked sound, the noise a lung makes when the air is punched out of it. "Mom," she stammered, her eyes darting between my face and the men behind me. "You were here. You watched us." I let the silence do the heavy lifting. I watched Derek's teeth begin to chatter a rhythmic vibration that sounded like dry seeds in a gourd. He looked at the hidden door, then at me, the realization dawning on him that his entire plan had been a play act performed for a one-woman audience. Have you ever seen the exact moment a person realizes their entire life is over? It doesn't look like a scream, it looks like a long, slow blink. Detective Miller didn't wait for them to recover. He began a methodical sweep of the room, his movements a sharp contrast to the porter's frantic scavenging. He moved toward Patricia, who was clutching her coat as if she could hide the bulk of what she had stolen. "Hands where I can see them, ma'am," Miller commanded. He reached into her pockets, pulling out the strand of antique pearls and Tom's gold wedding ring. He placed them into plastic evidence bags, the crinkle sounding like a sentence being written. "That strand of pearls belongs to the estate," Mrs. Porter Miller said. Sanchez was already at the desk, bagging the forged mortgage document and the pry bar. Rob Sterling stepped forward, holding the master tablet. "Everything is on the cloud," Derek Robb said. "The assault on Sunday, the lies you told the officers during the welfare check, and this little midnight excursion. We have the audio, the video, and the forensic metadata." I watched Rachel's face crumble. The arrogant woman who had stood at my dinner table was gone, replaced by a terrified child who finally understood the gravity of the law. She looked at the evidence bags, the detectives, and the man she had chosen over her own blood. She saw the sheer volume of proof I had curated, a mountain of evidence that made any defense impossible. Justice is a cold dish, and tonight I'm serving it in a room where my husband's memory was just spat upon. Before I reveal the detail that changes everything regarding the report I filed, are you still with me right now? Comment A, if Derek's greed was his downfall, or B, if Rachel's betrayal was worse, and give a brief reason why. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. The message is what I hope stays with you. I stepped further into the room, my shadow falling over the safe Derek had failed to crack. I was no longer the frail widow they thought they could bully. I was Veda Sterling, and 40 years of federal authority radiated from me like heat. "You forgot Tom's birthday, Rachel," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a cold wind. "But I never will, and neither will the district attorney. You thought you were stealing from a widow who had lost her edge, but you were just walking into a trap I've been baiting since February." I turned my gaze to Derek. "You kept talking about my lawyer, about how much Rob was costing me. You were so self-absorbed that you never even bothered to look at his middle name. Meet your Uncle Rob. He's Tom's younger brother, the biological executor of this trust, since before you even met my daughter. He isn't just my counsel, he is the guardian of the Sterling bloodline." The silence that followed was absolute. Rachel looked at Rob, then at me, the pieces finally clicking into place. She had been so eager to discard her family that she had forgotten who they were. She had desecrated a house guarded by the very man she thought was just a hired hand. I looked at the ruin of the study, the books on the floor, the flipped mattress in the hall, the shattered lamp. "You didn't just break into a house tonight," I told them, my voice dropping to a low register. "You desecrated a sanctuary. You treated your father's life like a bargain bin. And for what? For a safe that doesn't even hold the deeds you were looking for." Rachel looked at me like I was a ghost. She was right. The mother she thought she could bully was dead. The prosecutor had taken her place. I saw Derek's eyes darting toward the door, but Sanchez moved to block it. There was no way out. Not for Derek, not for Rachel, and certainly not for the elder Porters who had come along for the ride. As Detective Miller reached for his handcuffs, I held up my hand to stop him. "Wait," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I haven't told them the best part yet." I walked slowly toward Derek, the confirmation of a $430,000 wire transfer held between my fingers like a smoking gun that had already fired. The silence in the study was no longer heavy with the threat of violence. It was hollowed out by the sheer crushing weight of the irony I was about to deliver. Derek looked up at me from the floor, his face a blotchy, frantic red, while Rachel stood trembling beside the desk, her eyes fixed on the paper in my hand. "I gave you a miracle, Derek," I said, my voice as steady as the law I had served for 40 years. "I gave you your life back 3 months ago just to see if you had a shred of decency left." I held the document closer to his face so he could see the date, February 12th, and the offshore wire confirmation. "The emergency you used to terrorize my daughter was a phantom. I paid your marker anonymously. You were a free man before you ever stepped foot in this house for Easter dinner." Derek's face didn't just pale, it went a deathly hollow gray. The realization that he had committed a series of felonies to solve a problem that no longer existed seemed to drain the very air from his lungs. You paid it," he stammered, his voice a broken whisper. "I didn't have to do any of this." "No, Derek, you didn't," I replied. "But you wanted more than freedom. You wanted the prize. Do you know what's worse than being a victim? It's realizing you committed a crime to solve a problem that didn't even exist anymore." I turned my gaze from Derek's pathetic form to Rachel, who was staring at me with a look of shattered realization. My own heart felt like a cold, hard stone as I conducted this final moral autopsy on the daughter I had raised. "You traded your father's memory for a man who would have left you the moment the ink was dry on the deed." I told her my words, cutting through the room with a clinical precision. "The test was so simple, Rachel. If you had come to me with the truth, if you had asked for help instead of helping him ransack my life, I would have forgiven everything. I would have taken care of you both. Instead, you chose to attack a weak widow because you thought she was an easy mark. You proved tonight that you were never family. You were just a beneficiary waiting for a payout. Mom, please." I was scared she sobbed, her voice a sharp, jagged edge of desperation. "He made me believe we were in danger. He told me they would kill us." I didn't flinch. I looked at her with the same eyes I used to study defendants in a federal holding cell. "You weren't afraid of the danger, Rachel. You were afraid of losing the lifestyle Derek promised you. Don't look at me with those tear-filled eyes, Rachel. I spent 40 years hearing that exact same sound in interrogation rooms. It doesn't sound like love. It sounds like a plea deal." I looked at the ruin of the study and then at the detectives standing in the shadows. The time for maternal mercy had passed months ago. I revealed the final detail of the trust, then the one that made Rachel's knees give way. I signed over the entire estate to the St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, effective upon my death, I said. I disinherited you 5 years ago when you took that first 100,000 for Derek's startup. This heist wasn't just a crime, it was a literal effort to steal nothing. You've traded your freedom for an empty safe and a house you'll never see again." Detective Miller signaled to Sanchez, and the sharp rhythmic click-clack of steel handcuffs filled the room 4 times. 1 for Derek, 1 for Rachel, and 2 for the elder Porters, who had watched their son's greed with silent approval. Derek collapsed to his knees, weeping not for his sins or his wife, but for the lost prize he could no longer touch. Rachel stared at me as she was led toward the door, her face a mirror image of every broken criminal I had ever put behind bars. "Get them out of my sight, detective," I said, my back already turned to them. "I have a garden to tend to in the morning." I stood by the window and watched as they were led through the foyer past the portrait of Tom that Derek had so casually swept aside and out into the night. The driveway was filled with pulsing blue and red lights, a strobe light finale to the drama they had started. As Derek was being led toward the patrol car, I stepped onto the porch one last time. I leaned in and whispered a final truth into his ear, one that would haunt him through every year of his sentence. The men from Miami were actually undercover agents I coordinated with months ago to track the illegal gambling ring Derek. You were never in danger of your life. You were only ever in danger of your own cowardice. The house was finally quiet. The trash had been taken out. I watched the taillights of the patrol cars vanish down the long driveway, leaving me in a silence that finally felt clean, devoid of the scent of their desperation and cloying perfume. I turned to close the door, the salt sting of a single tear finally escaping my resolve, but I brushed it away before it could fall. I saw a single muddy crowbar lying on the porch, a reminder that some debts are paid in years, not dollars. The distant fading wail of a siren was the only sound left in the Millbrook Valley. I walked back into the foyer and looked at Tom's portrait, feeling the heavy burden of witness protection and the sterling legacy finally settling into a place of peace. I was alone, but for the first time in 3 years, the silence of the house didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a verdict. I locked the heavy oak door and armed the security system, the electronic hum a comforting lullaby. Tomorrow I would prune the roses, and the year after that I would do the same. The house was mine, the memory was pure, and the predators were exactly where they belonged. Freedom has a funny way of making you hyper-aware of the shadows, and as I watched the bail notifications flicker on my tablet, I realized Derek wasn't just running, he was doubling down. 2 days had passed since the first arrests, and the silence of the house was no longer peaceful. It was expectant. I sat at the kitchen island, the single muddy crowbar from the porch now tagged and sitting in an evidence bag on the counter. It was a souvenir of a debt that hadn't been fully settled. My phone buzzed with an encrypted alert from Rob Sterling. I swiped the screen, reading the news I already sensed in the marrow of my bones. Derek, Rachel, and the elder Porters had all posted bail. They had used a predatory bondsman and liquidated a series of hidden assets I hadn't yet flagged for the FBI. But the most alarming detail was a series of low-resolution street cam photos Rob had intercepted. Derek had been seen meeting with Eddie Caruso, a bottom-feeder associate of the Marcello family leftovers. Eddie Caruso, a 40-year-old career criminal with a neck like a bull and a rap sheet that read like a tour of the state's worst zip codes, was the kind of man you hired when you stopped caring about the law and started caring about blood. "He is out." "Rob," I said into the receiver, my voice a flat, dangerous line. "I can feel the air in this house getting heavier." Rob's voice crackled through the encrypted line, sounding weary. "Derek doesn't want a legal defense anymore, Veda. He wants leverage. He's convinced himself that the physical trust documents or the Marcello money must still be inside those walls. He's hired a blunt instrument to find it." I looked at the monitors watching the perimeter of my estate. Derek's narcissism had transitioned into a scorched earth policy. He didn't post bail for Rachel. He left my daughter in a county cell to rot while he used his remaining cash to hire a hitman. It was the ultimate betrayal in a week defined by them. Do you know what happens to a man when he loses his pride? He doesn't go looking for his dignity. He goes looking for a bigger hammer. I began the protocols for a Level 4 breach, arming the internal secondary shutters and calling Officer Mitchell the lead on my rapid response detail. The target is Derek Porter, I told him. He is bringing a professional this time. The rules of engagement are clear non-lethal until the threshold is crossed. By evening, I was tucked away in the hidden reading room, the blue glow of the localized server, the only light in the space. I reviewed the high-resolution footage from a parking lot near the docks. Derek was handing a thick manila envelope of cash to Eddie Caruso. "Look at him," I whispered to the empty room. "He's selling his last Rolex just to pay for a crowbar." Caruso moved with the methodical silence of a career burglar, checking the weight of a heavy-duty pry bar before sliding it into the back of a dark SUV. They were coming tonight. I knew it as surely as I knew the weight of a gavel. Desperation is the loudest smell in the world, and Derek was currently reeking of it. He believed he was the predator now that the old lady would be an easy mark once the lights went out. He had no idea that I had spent the afternoon replacing the safety glass in the library with one-way ballistic glass. He would be able to break it, but he wouldn't be able to see that I was standing 5 feet away in the shadows with 4 armed officers. At exactly 2 a.m., the perimeter sensors tripped. A dark SUV idled at the edge of the property, its headlights extinguished. I watched the monitors as 2 figures emerged from the tree line. One moved with the clumsy, frantic desperation of Derek Porter. The other was the silent, predatory shadow of Eddie Caruso. They bypassed the front door, knowing the magnetic locks were too much for a field kit, and headed straight for the library window. I sat in the darkness of the study, my hand resting on the master lockdown button. "You might think I'm taking a risk," I murmured, though there was no one to hear me. "But I've spent my life in rooms with men far worse than Eddie Caruso. The difference is, tonight I own the room." I watched Caruso raise the crowbar, his muscles bunching under his dark jacket. He wasn't looking for a silent entry. He was looking for a breach. The first strike hit the frame with a heavy rhythmic thud that vibrated through the floorboards beneath my feet. The sound of splintering wood began to fill the quiet house, a jagged, violent noise that signaled the end of the legal phase and the beginning of the war. Derek was shouting now, his voice a muffled, panicked hiss through the glass. "Just get the papers, Derek. I don't care if you have to burn the place down around her." I felt a cold, crystalline anger settle over me. This was the man who had sat at my table, who had pretended to love my daughter, now ready to torch my life for a ledger. "Wait," Caruso whispered, his gravelly voice barely caught by the external microphones. What was that sound? It sounded like a heavy door locking. He was intuitive. I'll give him that. He had heard the secondary shutters engaging behind the library doors, sealing them into the room they were about to enter. It was too late to turn back now. The momentum of their greed was a train without brakes. The library window didn't just break. It exploded inward with a sharp, crystalline ring of shattering glass. The safety glass I'd installed held for a second before yielding in a spray of diamonds that caught the moonlight. Through the jagged, broken frame, I saw Derek's eyes. They were wide, bloodshot, and devoid of anything resembling a son's love. He looked like a man possessed by a hunger he couldn't name. Cold night air rushed into the warm house, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and exhaust. Caruso hopped over the sill first, his boots hitting the carpet with a heavy, muffled thud, followed closely by Derek, who was still clutching the manila envelope as if it were a shield. I sat in the absolute darkness of the inner study, my finger hovering over the trigger for the high-intensity floodlights. The second invasion had begun, and this time the handcuffs wouldn't be the only thing waiting for them in the dark. Courtrooms don't have the smell of justice. They smell of stale coffee, recycled air, and the slow, agonizing rot of family secrets being exposed under fluorescent lights. I sat in the front row of the Millbrook County Courthouse, my back straight, my bandaged cheek now a thin white scar that throbbed in time with the rhythmic pounding of the judge's gavel. The transition from the violent, shattered glass of the library to this sterile environment had been swift. Derek and Eddie Caruso had been tackled before they could even reach the safe, but today was about the paper trail they thought they could bury. Across the room, Rachel sat at the defendant's table, her designer clothes replaced by a nondescript navy suit that couldn't hide the hollow, haunted look in her eyes. Derek sat beside his own counsel, his posture still radiating a delusional arrogance. Unaware that I was the one who had spent the last 3 months feeding the prosecution every bullet they were about to fire. As I took my seat and watched the courtroom fill, a small detail surfaced in my memory. I remembered Derek mentioning that doctor again, Dr. Miles Cunningham, the same man he had tried to use to question my sanity. Back then, it had sounded like a threat. Now I knew it was just another piece of evidence waiting to be exposed. The trial began with the forensic audit reveal. The lead investigator took the stand, his voice a dry, clinical drone that stripped the glamour from Rachel's art gallery. He detailed a sophisticated network of fraudulent transactions, showing exactly how Derek had used the business as a laundry for his gambling losses and the silent loans he'd taken from people who didn't use banks. I watched the jury's faces as the auditor produced signature after signature. "The paper trail doesn't lie, Mrs. Porter," he said, looking directly at Rachel. "Every signature here represents a theft from your own future." Rachel flinched as if he'd struck her. I didn't know she whispered, her voice barely caught by the court microphones. "He told me it was just a bridge loan." She was technically right. The record suggested she was under immense psychological duress, but in a courtroom, duress is just a mitigating factor, not a magic eraser for grand larceny. Have you ever seen a house of cards fall? It doesn't make a loud noise. It's just the sound of paper sliding against paper until everything is flat. After the lunch recess, the air in the room shifted. In a move that stunned the defense, the prosecution called Sienna Blake to the stand. Sienna Blake, 29, and wearing a dress that cost more than my monthly mortgage, took the stand with the practiced poise of a woman who was used to being watched but had never been truly seen. She was a lifestyle influencer, a creature of filters and fleeting trends, but her testimony was painfully real. I was the one who had tracked her down, showing her evidence that Derek was skimming money from her own earnings to pay off his Miami debts. Now she was my star witness. Sienna revealed her 2-year affair with Derek, producing a series of text messages and bank transfers that laid bare exactly where Rachel's so-called business emergency had gone: $180,000 for a fake startup loan that never existed, $140,000 for illegal offshore gambling debts, and $110,000 funneled directly into Sienna's luxury lifestyle designer trips. Penthouse stays and a leased Mercedes Derek told her was a gift. Derek told me the house was already his. She testified, her voice steady and cool. He said his mother-in-law was just a tenant he was waiting to evict. He promised me we'd be in Paris by September. He called Rachel a necessary weight he had to carry for a few more months until the deeds were signed over, which is worse, being hated by your enemies or being a punchline for the person you thought loved you. I watched Rachel as Sienna read a particularly cruel text message from Derek, mocking her pathetic, needy loyalty. And my daughter's face didn't just turn pale, it turned a ghostly, translucent white. She looked at Derek, searching for a denial, but he was busy whispering frantically to his lawyer, his eyes refusing to meet hers. The betrayal wasn't just a secret anymore. It was a public record entered into evidence as Exhibit 42. The cold metallic scent of the defendant's table seemed to overwhelm her. I felt a heavy professional sadness. I had won. The trap I had set in February had functioned perfectly, but the prize was the total destruction of the child I had once tucked into bed. The prosecution had stripped Derek of his mask, but they had stripped Rachel of her reason to live. Rachel finally snapped. It wasn't a calculated move, it was a catastrophic breakdown. As Sienna began to describe a vacation Derek had funded with the emergency money I had faked, Rachel lunged. She bypassed her lawyer with a speed born of pure, unadulterated rage and threw herself across the table at Derek. Her hands clawed at his face, her fingers seeking the eyes that had lied to her for years. "I gave up everything for you," she screamed, her voice a raw, jagged sound that filled every corner of the courtroom. "I betrayed my mother for a man who wanted me in a cage." The sound of her silk dress tearing as she lunged at him was like a final curtain call. Bailiffs swarmed the area, immediately pinning Rachel to the floor as Derek cowered behind his chair, his arrogance finally replaced by a shivering, pathetic fear. Order. The judge shouted, her gavel hitting the bench with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Restrain the defendant immediately. I stood up slowly as the courtroom descended into chaos. Veda Sterling, the prosecutor, watched the scene with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a chemical reaction she had triggered. Derek's own lawyer subtly withdrew a key defense motion during the scuffle, effectively signaling to the court that his client was now indefensible, a move I recognized as a silent surrender. The gavel fell one last time, a final heavy thud that signaled the end of the day's proceedings. As the bailiffs dragged a weeping, broken Rachel from the room, she locked eyes with me for 1 second. The dry, acrid taste of courtroom water was in my mouth as I realized that in that look, I didn't see the daughter I loved. I saw the mirror image of every broken criminal I had ever put behind bars. The case was won, the villains were exposed, and the legacy was safe. But as I walked toward the exit, the weight of the victory felt heavier than any defeat I had ever endured. Justice doesn't always feel like a victory. Sometimes it just feels like the final, exhausting click of a lock that should have been turned years ago. I sat on a polished wooden bench in the courthouse hallway, the heavy silence only broken by the distant muffled sounds of a city continuing on without the porters. Rob Sterling sat beside me. His hand steepled, his eyes fixed on the heavy double doors of the courtroom. We were waiting for the jury to return, but the wait was merely a formality. The evidence I had gathered, the 4K footage of the assault, the recordings of the perjury, the forensic trail of the gallery, was an avalanche they couldn't outrun. Suddenly, the quiet was interrupted by the sound of scuffing shoes. Warren Porter approached me, flanked by a court-appointed attorney who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Warren's expensive suit from Easter was gone, replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting blazer that smelled of nervous sweat and stale coffee. "I can give you the names," Veda Warren rasped, leaning in until I could see the broken capillaries in his nose. He was a small man who had grown old without ever growing up, a parasite looking for one last host. "I can help you get back every cent Derek hid in those offshore accounts if you just talk to the judge for us. Tell her Patricia and I were just following orders." I looked at him with a disgust so profound it felt like a physical weight. "You didn't just steal money, Warren," I replied, my voice a low-level thrum of authority. "You tried to steal my husband's peace. You tried to dismantle a legacy you weren't fit to mention. There is no deal for that. Besides, I already recovered Derek's offshore accounts weeks ago using my own federal contacts. Your bargain is an attempt to sell me information I already own." The look of hollow defeat that crossed his face was the only payment I required. Rob stood up, his presence enough to send Warren scurrying back to the other end of the hall. "Do you know what the hardest part of being a prosecutor is? It's not the bad guys. It's seeing how much good people are willing to destroy just for a taste of what they didn't earn." The buzzer sounded and the court reconvenes for the reading of the verdict. I took my seat as the jury filed in, their faces grim and set. The judge, a woman who mirrored my own career, Steele took her bench with the gravity of a storm front moving in. The Honorable Elena Vance, a woman whose gray hair was as sharp as her legal mind, didn't waste time. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The words hit the floor like lead weights. The jury found all defendants guilty on all counts: conspiracy, grand larceny, and felony assault. Judge Vance looked over her glasses at the defendant's table, her voice blistering. "You are not a family. You are a criminal enterprise that happened to share a last name. You targeted a widow in her own sanctuary, treating her like a mark in a low-rent con. 25 years, Mr. Porter. I suggest you use them to reflect on the price of greed." Derek's shoulders sagged until he looked 20 years older, his arrogance finally crushed under the weight of a sentence he couldn't charm his way out of. Warren and Patricia were handed 10 and 8 years respectively, their sporting roles in the fraud and break-in finally carrying a price tag they couldn't afford. Rachel was sentenced last. She received 8 years reduced to 5, with the requirement of full testimony against Derek's remaining associates. As the chains rattled, the defendants were led toward the holding cells. The dry, papery sound of the jury's verdict being unfolded was replaced by the rhythmic, echoing clink-clink of leg irons on the marble floor. I stood at the back of the room, my back straight, my face unreadable. I watched my daughter disappear through the heavy steel doors, her head bowed. I hope the silence in your cell is loud enough for you to finally hear your father's voice. Rachel, I whispered to the empty air. Mom, wait. Don't let them take me. Her final plea was cut short as the doors thudded shut. The courtroom was finally empty of the porters, but the air still felt stained like a room that had held a long, slow fire. The cycle of betrayal had been broken by the very law I spent my life defending, but the completion of the mission didn't bring the joy I had imagined. It only brought a quiet, heavy peace. I walked out of the courthouse and felt the first true chill of October, the biting wind whipping through my coat. The case was closed, the record was sealed, and the Sterling name had been protected. As I reached my car, the mechanical click of the locks felt like a period at the end of a very long sentence. I saw a familiar envelope tucked under my windshield wiper, a plain white rectangle against the dark glass. I pulled it out, my fingers tracing the handwritten address. It was a letter from a prison I hadn't visited yet, the script unmistakably Rachel's, but devoid of the frantic loops of her usual style. It was the first sign of the long road ahead. As Derek was being led away in the distance to the transport van, he tried to shout one last insult at the sky, but his voice failed him, his power entirely dependent on my perceived weakness. He was just a man in a jumpsuit, now a ghost in the system. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine idling as I stared at the envelope. Exhausted but liberated, I realized that the house would be quiet tonight, and for the first time, that silence wouldn't be a target. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror and saw the federal prosecutor looking back, but behind her eyes there was something else, the widow who was finally ready to tend to her own garden. The courtroom hallway was miles behind me now, but the weight of the day stayed with me. I tucked the letter into my bag, not ready to read it yet, and drove toward the only place that still mattered. The Sterling estate was waiting, and I had roses to prune before the first frost claimed them. The verdict was peace, and for the first time in years, I was going home to enjoy it. A prison envelope has a specific weight. It's the weight of iron bars of wasted years, and of a daughter's ink finally admitting to a mother's truth. I sat in my car, the engine idling in the cold October air outside the courthouse, staring at the handwritten address. The trial was over. The porters were in chains, and the Sterling name was legally vindicated, yet my hands felt heavier than they ever had in a courtroom. I tore the seal the sound like a sharp intake of breath in the quiet cabin. The letter inside was not the frantic looping scrawl of the Rachel I had known for the last decade. It was precise, quiet, and devastatingly honest. She wasn't begging for bail or screaming about unfairness anymore. Instead, she laid out the anatomy of her own destruction. She described Derek's 2-year gaslighting campaign with a clarity that made my blood run cold. He had systematically isolated her, using his gambling debts as a weapon to make her feel like an accomplice before she had even committed a single crime. He made me feel like the house was already burning, Mom, and he was the only one. With water, she wrote. I didn't choose him over you. I chose the person I thought would keep me from drowning. I felt a microscopic crack in my ice-cold resolve. For the first time, I wasn't looking at a predator through the lens of a prosecutor. I was looking at the daughter I had lost through the wreckage of her own choices. Do you think a mother's love is unconditional? It's not. It's a contract. And Rachel had breached every single clause. It took me a month of silence before I could bring myself to cross the threshold of the Millbrook Women's Correctional Facility. The sensory experience of the prison was a ghost I had spent 40 years living with: the sharp buzzers, the redundant metal detectors, the heavy cloying smell of industrial floor wax. It reminded me of the decades I spent on the other side of the glass putting people in these very rooms. I waited in the visiting area, my back straight, my hands folded over the high-fidelity recording pen I had tucked into my pocket. When Rachel was let in, the physical change was jarring. Gone were the expensive highlights and the vanity of the boutique lifestyle. Her hair was its natural, dull brown, and the orange jumpsuit fit her like a shroud. She looked small. She looked like the child she had been before Derek had rewritten her soul. "You look like yourself again, Rachel," I said, my voice a level thrum, not the version Derek curated for his own purposes. She didn't look away this time. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking against the glass. "I just needed you to know that I finally remembered Dad's birthday." Buzz, clack, thud. The language of prison is built on monosyllables and metal. I listened for 2 hours as Rachel provided the final pieces of the puzzle that even my surveillance hadn't fully captured. She spoke about the life insurance policy Derek had secretly taken out on me, a detail that confirmed his Phase 2 would have ended in my accidental death. She gave me names and offshore accounts related to the Marcello Associates information that would ensure Derek never saw the outside of a cell for the rest of his natural life. It wasn't a Hallmark reunion. It was an interrogation of the soul, a clinical extraction of the truth. As I watched her raw, bitten fingernails pick at the crinkle of the cheap-lined yellow paper she had used for her notes, I realized that while she had been weak, she wasn't malignant. She was the collateral damage of a man I had allowed into my sanctuary. I told her then that the house was gone, that the Sterling estate now belonged to the Trust for the Children at St. Jude. There was no inheritance left to fight over. "I'm not Mom yet, Rachel," I told her, standing up as the guard approached. "I'm just the only person who hasn't lied to you. We'll see what the next letter brings. Forgiveness isn't a light switch. It's a long, dark hallway. And I'm only just taking the first step." I walked out of the facility, the cold air of November hitting my face like a splash of water. The burden of Tom's legacy felt different now, not like a shield I had to hold up against the world, but like a foundation I was finally ready to build upon. I had recorded every word of her confession on my pen. It wasn't for evidence anymore. The trial was a closed book. I wanted it for the foundation. I wanted her voice to be the first lesson in our training program on elder coercion, a genuine record of how easily a sanctuary can be turned into a cage. As I reached my car, I saw my brother-in-law, Rob Sterling, waiting for me in the parking lot. He was leaning against his sedan, a thick stack of papers in his hand, and a look on his face that said the legal battle was finally transitioning into its public phase. "Veda, we have the final charter signatures," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a judge passing a favorable sentence. "The Sterling Elder Protection Foundation is officially live." I looked at the papers, then back at the looming gray walls of the prison. The secondary villains were handled, the doctor had lost his license, and the Marcello Associates were being picked up one by one in Miami. All the loops were closing. The legal war was won, but the emotional peace was still a work in progress. I took the papers from Rob, the crisp parchment, a symbol of the new life I was creating from the ashes of the old one. I looked at my reflection in the car window and saw Veda Sterling looking back, not a widow, not a victim, but a woman who had pruned the dead wood from her life so that something new could grow. I got into the car, the silence of the cabin finally feeling like a choice rather than a consequence. I watched the prison gates in my rearview mirror as I drove away, knowing that while Rachel was still behind bars, she was finally free of the man who had truly imprisoned her. I had a foundation to launch and a garden to tend, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't checking the cameras before I closed my eyes. Rob Sterling didn't hand me a celebratory bottle of champagne. He handed me a thick, legal-bound charter for the Sterling Elder Protection Foundation. And for the first time in years, the weight in my hands felt like building something rather than burying it. We sat in a quiet corner of a local Millbrook diner, the kind of place where the scent of burnt coffee and maple syrup acted as a grounded contrast to the sterile complexity of the last few months. The crisp morning air of the Sterling estate was still fresh on my skin as I watched the first foundation signs being hammered into the frost-hardened soil of our perimeter. The charter was more than just paper. It was a manifesto. "We aren't just giving legal advice, Rob," I said, my voice steady as I ran a thumb over the gold-embossed seal. "We're giving them the teeth to bite back. For 40 years, I had dismantled mob hierarchies from a mahogany desk, and now I was using that same steel to protect the vulnerable from their own blood." We finalized the mission that morning, providing specialized legal aid for seniors facing financial coercion. I insisted that the recovered heirlooms, the silver, the pearls, the rings, and the liquidation of Derek's hidden Florida assets serve as the initial endowment. It felt right that the very things they tried to steal would become the armor for someone else. Rob took a sip of his bitter, earthy coffee, his eyes meeting mine with a shared understanding. The sterling name used to be about witness protection Veda, he noted. Now it is about transparency. We were the ultimate deterrent. A retired judge and a former federal prosecutor were not the people a greedy heir wanted to see in the discovery phase of a lawsuit. The law is a blunt instrument. Justice is a surgeon's scalpel. Tonight I was holding both, and I had never felt more precise. By January, the final federal loops began to snap shut with a satisfying click. I received a secure call in my study from my old contacts at the Department of Justice. The Marcello-linked gambling ring that had acted as the anvil to Derek's hammer had been dismantled, their offshore servers seized, and their leadership indicted. But the real satisfaction came from the papers regarding Patricia and Warren. Their clumsy bankruptcy fraud in Florida had caught the eye of federal investigators I'd whispered to months ago. The Florida creditors were stripping them bare. They had nothing left but their orange jumpsuits and the memory of a boutique lifestyle they never earned. I realized that by following the rules of evidence, I didn't just stop a home invasion. I triggered a domino effect that wiped out a whole system of parasites. Greed is a hungry animal. Eventually, it always eats itself. Every legal loop I closed was a stitch in a wound that had been festering for far too long. Do you know what's more satisfying than seeing a villain in handcuffs? It's seeing the look on their face when they realize you're the one who signed the endowment for their prison's legal library. I watched a local news segment that evening, the blue-white flicker of the screen illuminating the foyer where the bait silver used to sit. The report covered the sentencing of Derek Porter and what they were calling the Millbrook conspiracy. My own face was blurred, described as a sophisticated survivor who had outplayed a tactical burglary team. The report detailed the total disbarment of Dr. Miles Cunningham, the man Derek had tried to buy for a competency hearing. He was gone, his license revoked, his reputation a smoking ruin. I stood in the foyer, the silence of the house finally feeling clean, devoid of the rot of betrayal. They thought they were the smart ones in the room, I whispered to the empty air. They forgot who built the room. I felt a surge of quiet triumph as I reviewed a discovery from the evidence lockers, a hidden ledger found in Derek's seized SUV. The entry twist was that I had used my own anonymous offshore emergency fund to buy the very boutique property Patricia had lost in Florida, specifically to turn it into the foundation's urban headquarters. But the exit twist in that ledger was even darker. It contained Derek's detailed plans to defraud his own parents of their remaining hidden bankruptcy cash once he had secured my estate. The antagonists had been planning to betray each other as much as they had planned to destroy me. It was a circle of vultures, and they had eventually run out of meat. Every legal loop I closed was a stitch in a wound that had been festering for far too long. The case was closed, and the legacy Tom had left behind was finally in hands that intended to keep it pure. As the news report flickered out, the house settled into a peaceful, heavy quiet. I walked to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains. The winter moon was high, casting long silver shadows across the driveway. There, standing by the garden gate, was a young man with a set of professional gardening shears. He was Mateo, the first of the foundation's legacy apprentices I had hired to keep Tom's roses blooming. I watched him check the tension on the gate, his movements respectful and careful. He represented the future, a future where this house wasn't a target but a classroom. I felt the cold, smooth feel of my fountain pen in my hand as I prepared to sign the final deeds over to the trust. Justice isn't a finish line, I realized. It's a house that finally feels clean. I turned off the foyer lights not because I was hiding, but because I finally had nothing left to fear in the dark. The predators were gone, the loops were closed, and tomorrow I would finally step back into the garden and plant the last rose. The dirt under my fingernails feels more honest than any legal brief I've ever filed. A gritty reminder that life doesn't stop just because you've finally finished pruning the dead wood from your family tree. The morning sun hit the rich, dark soil of Tom's rose garden, turning the frost-kissed petals into shimmering jewels of ice and color. I stepped out onto the lawn, the sharp, rhythmic snip of pruning shears echoing in the quiet valley air. Waiting for me by the trellis was Mateo, a 19-year-old with sun-darkened skin and eyes that looked at the roses with a reverence I hadn't seen in decades. He was the first youth apprentice from the Sterling Foundation's local outreach program, a program designed to give a second chance to kids who had seen too much of the system too early. Mateo was the first breath of new life the Sterling estate had felt since the trial, and as I watched him work, I felt a familiar tension in my shoulders finally begin to dissolve. I walked him through the rows, explaining Tom's specific grafting techniques and the complex history of the double delight bushes that lined the northern fence. Tom always said, "You don't grow roses with your hands, Mateo. You grow them with your patience." I told him, my voice a soft, steady cadence. This isn't just a garden. It's a testament to what happens when you refuse to let the weeds win. You have to be willing to cut back the parts that are choking the life out of the center, even if it hurts to look at. Mateo nodded, his hands moving with a respectful, eager precision as he worked the damp soil. I realized then that I was no longer just protecting a vault or a memory. I was planting the seeds for a future where my husband's sanctuary served the living. What would you have done? Would you have dodged the glass, or would you have let it hit you just to make sure the evidence was undeniable? Looking at Mateo, I knew I had made the only choice that could have led us here. By the end of the week, I prepared a specific spot in the very center of the garden for the final rose bush of the season, the 48th. It represented each year Tom and I were married, a living timeline of a life built on trust and eventually defended by blood. The rough texture of the 48th rose bush's stem grazed my palms as I lowered it into the earth. I'd recently found a journal in Tom's study, one he'd kept in his final months, where he expressed his unspoken fears about the path Rachel was taking. I realized then that my Phase 1 and Phase 2 weren't just about survival. They were the fulfillment of Tom's silent prayer for the house to remain a place of integrity, even if it required a painful pruning. "I fulfilled the contract, Tom," I whispered into the cold afternoon air. "The house is safe. The legacy is pure. 48 years, and I'm still learning how to let you go. A garden is just a courtroom where nature is the judge, and the only evidence that matters is the color of the petals." I stood up and brushed the damp earth from my knees, looking toward the heavy stone pillars at the end of the driveway. I had recently finalized a specific clause in the foundation charter one that Rob had questioned at first. It allowed Rachel to petition for a job as a low-level gardener upon her release from prison. It wasn't a gift, it was a path. She would have to complete 5 years of incident-free incarceration and intense psychological rehabilitation first. If she could prove she was capable of nurturing something instead of just consuming it, the garden would be waiting. It was the last piece of the prosecutor's puzzle, a chance for redemption that had to be earned, not given. I felt a sense of deep, final closure. The ghosts of the Marcello trial and the shadows of Derek's greed were finally receding, replaced by the simple, demanding needs of the soil. On the final evening of January, I sat on my front porch with a cup of tea, the warmth of the porcelain comforting against my palms. The winter sunset was spectacular, painting the Millbrook Valley in vibrant, fading hues of bruised purple and gold. I touched the faint, thin scar on my cheek. I no longer felt the sting of the glass or the heat of the betrayal. I only felt the quiet strength of the survival. I looked at the new sign at the end of the long driveway, the Sterling Elder Protection Foundation. It was a beacon of transparency in a town that had known too many secrets. The house was quiet, and for the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like an invitation. The sun dipped below the horizon. The case was closed. The verdict was peace. "I am Veda Sterling," I said to the encroaching dark, my voice clear and certain. "I am a prosecutor, a widow, and a survivor, and I am finally home." I had officially and legally reclaimed my maiden name weeks ago, dropping the Porter name like a soiled garment. It was my final act of detachment, a symbolic return to the woman I was before the wolves tried to claim my territory. I watched the last sliver of light vanish behind the mountains, the scar on my cheek, a thin white line of victory in the dark. The mechanical hum of the security system was still there, but I no longer checked the monitor feeds with a racing heart. The predators were in cages, the legacy was secure in a public trust, and the roses were sleeping under a blanket of rich, honest earth. I took a final sip of my tea and stood up the floorboards of the porch, solid beneath my feet. I didn't need to check the cameras before I closed my eyes tonight. I walked inside, locked the door for the last time out of habit rather than fear, and let the darkness of the Sterling estate wrap around me like a well-earned rest. Looking back, I realized my greatest mistake wasn't trusting the law. It was trusting blood without question. This family drama story taught me that love without boundaries becomes a weapon others can use against you. I thought patience would fix everything, but silence only gave betrayal room to grow. In many family revenge stories, people focus on punishment. But for me, the real lesson was protection. Protect your dignity, your legacy, and your peace before it's too late. If you ever find yourself in a situation like this family drama story, don't wait for proof to become pain. Speak early, set limits, and never confuse loyalty with self-sacrifice. I believe God allowed me to face this, not to break me, but to remind me that strength must be used to defend what is right, not just endure what is wrong. These family revenge stories aren't about destruction, they're about awakening. And this family drama story is proof that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought inside your own home. In the end, I didn't win because they lost. I won because I refused to stay blind. And like many family revenge stories, the real victory isn't revenge, it's clarity. Thank you for walking with me to the end of this journey. If you were in Veda's position facing betrayal from your own family, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly want to hear your perspective. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future videos. Please note, while inspired by real-life family conflicts and inheritance disputes, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this kind of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that better match your interests.